2. Eh bien, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Bonjour Dan.
Bonjour.
So, pour les gens qui nous rejoignent pour la première fois, bienvenue sur la chaîne YouTube Adobe France. Pour les habitués, vous allez être un petit peu surpris puisque, comme la session que nous avions donnée il y a quelques jours avec Christine Arf, c'est une session qui est en lien avec les conférences TP Talks de Type at Paris qui ont lieu durant le mois de juin sur Paris. Et nous profitons de cette occasion pour recevoir des designers internationaux. Et ces designers internationaux, s'ils ne parlent pas français, nous allons parler en anglais pendant toute la session. Donc je sais que de temps en temps, les habitués de la chaîne vont me dire « bah tiens, c'est pas en français cette fois-ci ». Non, désolé pour cette fois-ci. On va le faire en anglais parce que ça nous permet quand même d'avoir des invités qui sont très intéressants avec un passif dans le graphisme, dans la typographie, etc. Et donc on va en profiter de cette manière-là. So I'm gonna switch to English now. These were the last few French words you're gonna listen to. Oh, you wanna do it in French?
No.
No, because
No.
I guess we might have people asking for that at one moment. So I'm here with Dan Reynolds, and we're gonna spend 1 and something hour around his works, where he comes from, what he does, what kind of I don't know, background inside arts, graphic design, everything around. It's up to you to guide us. So let's start with easy things. Dan, who are you?
Hello. Well, I'm Dan Reynolds. I'm a type designer. I live in Berlin, in Germany. I'm from the United States originally, and I moved to Europe when I was about 21.
So that's been a long time, 18 years?
Right, about 18 years. I've also lived in England for a year, but almost all of my professional experience and a lot of my education too has been over here.
Mm-hmm. So education, where did you, I suppose 21 when you moved, so you already had part of graphic education?
Yeah, I was basically done. I started university in the US when I was 17.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to study graphic design, and that was a 4-year program. And I had the opportunity to spend a semester abroad during that course, and I ended up doing that, but the only time I was able to fit it in was my last semester. So I spent my 8th semester abroad in Wiesbaden, which is in Germany, sort of near Frankfurt.
Ooh.
And that was not my first time in Europe or even my first time in Germany, but it was my first time sort of as an adult. It was my first time as a university student, and I got a glimpse at what German design was. It was a different from what I had experienced with American design so far. I mean, I had only really been a student in the US, but I was able to get some work experience as an intern and then working sort of part-time for design companies while I was already studying. But I went back to the United States and I worked in Washington, D.C. for a year, a little more than a year, and then I came to Germany again, and I studied visuelle Kommunikation, that's sort of visual communication, I guess.
Yeah, that sounds like that.
Yeah. Right, in Offenbach, which is also near Frankfurt. It's just on the other side of Frankfurt from Wiesbaden. So that was sort of my formal education as a graphic designer. And a few years later, in 2007, I went to England to study type design at the University of Reading, and I did the type design master's course there. That was about 12 months.
12 months of master course? Long one?
It was 12 whole months. Some one-year master's courses are really about 9 months because they don't do anything during the summer. We had to spend the whole summer working.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, well...
That might remind things to the Type Paris attendees, because they're already working since Monday.
That's right.
I guess. And it's a holiday, it's bank holiday in France.
Today?
No, on Monday.
On Monday.
So they've been working since Monday, from what I read, and they're going to be working for the next 5 weeks.
Summer's a great time to draw letters,
especially if you've got aircon.
Yeah.
So that's very nice of as a way of moving from the US to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
I might share your screen from the. I might share your screen, well, my screen first,
Mm-hmm.
so that we can see your website.
Yeah.
Typeoff.de. That's live now. So this is your website, and these are.
I've never seen it so large before.
Oh, sorry.
That's fine.
I might show it like that. Is it good?
Oh, no, it's great. It looks great.
That's good. So you're designing fonts.
Yeah.
A lot of them, because you're designing web fonts, and you've had a background also around the black letters. You get two very different categories inside.
Right.
Explain a little bit, because.
Well, I have this black letter resources section on my website. That's kind of a work in progress. I had a site that had been up there for about 10 years that I took apart in October, and I've been meaning to come back to it since then. The main image you have right on the screen now is a classification of different kinds of black letter. And there's some text on the website there that I've written for various articles. And, you know, when you come to Germany from the US, you have some stereotypical associations with Germany in your mind, and black letter is very old-fashioned.
Yeah.
And so, of course, as soon as I came to Germany as a designer, I wanted to find everything out about these black letter typefaces that I could. And so really for a long time now I've been interested in black letter, in the different kinds of black letter, why the different styles in the subclassifications of black letter look different. I started out many years ago naively trying to design my own black letter typeface, and I was pulling sort of inspiration from different sub-styles, and it didn't work together at all.
Oh.
And it was really through that experience that I realized, okay, this is really kind of like mixing Roman and Italic and sans serif together into one word. It's not going to work. What is it that made these individual sub-styles look the way they did? This is probably that was probably my hook, both into type design and also into type research. I later did a lot of theoretical work in type research and type history, which is most of why I'm here in Paris today for the talk at Type Paris tonight. And I haven't ever released a proper black letter typeface. It is something that I would like to do someday, but I'm not sure exactly when I'm going to get the opportunity to work on that.
To do one, a complete one.
I mean, it's not going to be a bestseller, that sort of thing. So
that's always complicated. But I see that in the way you've organized your research and your classification. Do you know if it had already been done before? Because we know the Vox ATP and everything.
Yes. There's a similar classification system to Vox ATP in Germany, and it includes all of the different black letter categories, or at least if you look here at the graphic that's on the screen, there's the second row that says Textura, Rotunda, Schwabacher, and Fraktur. Those are all in one color. Those are sub categories within the black letter category in the German classification system. The things that are around that, both above it and below it, are kind of more informal categories that you see in typography and in type design. There's always in classification systems like another bucket called other,
branch,
where you put everything that doesn't fit. So there's also a black letter category in the official German system called Frakturvariationen, or black letter variations, and that's where for instance, what I have on the very right of the screen of experiment and hybrids and contemporary would go, although I don't like that sort of headline variations. I haven't found a better term so far. And within Textura, which is really a French style originally, there are more modern interpretations that I placed below it, although there's not sort of sharp lines for those the way that there is a sharp line that's accepted between Textura and Rotunda, for instance.
That's good. That's very funny to see how things can be solid, and it's important. I know that you've when I was trying to do a couple of research, you have a very complicated Flickr website where you put all your research.
Yes, I've started feeding it again. Flickr is a site that I think I signed up for it back in about 2005. And the typographic community really took to Flickr all around the world. We exchanged pictures. Whenever we would go on vacation, we would take pictures of signs and we would put them up on Flickr and comment on them. This was really even sort of before Twitter took off. We moved a lot of our conversation over to Twitter more than a decade ago now, I guess. And my Flickr site was dormant for a long time, sort of maybe 5 years or so. I hardly posted anything. But then about a year ago, I started putting new content on it again. Now you can see some research that I did with students in Berlin for train station signage. There's a few train lines in the city that do still use black letter typefaces, and I had my students drive around the city and take photos and make some sort of graphics that explained the differences between the letter forms on those signs. We even found the plans that were supposedly used to make all of the letters. But for instance, on this slide that you see here, there's sort of like a pink background and then a black letter form on top of that, or a black colored form. And the pink one is... The pink is what it's supposed to be, and the black is what... ended up being made by the people who made that sign. So that we were trying to track all of that, and the project had a lot more image, and every student made their own little book, but I put some of the images up on Flickr, and I wrote an article about it on my website for other people who might be interested in these letter forms and why they're still around as part of the Berlin transit network, that they can find some information about that.
That's good. So, black letter historical fonts from Germany, but in the end, nothing you designed was a black letter.
No, that's right. I mean, I have drawn many black letter letters and tried to make fonts work with those. It's something I haven't tried for a long time. But when I first started drawing type, I thought that this was the thing that I was going to do, I guess. And I sort of moved away from that, but I never lost my interest in the formal language that the letters have.
Nice, very, very nice. And if we still move around to your website, there's also all the web fonts you've been designing.
Yes.
So those web fonts were typefaces you designed for yourself or for a company, or is it your own company?
There's kind of a mix. It's really almost all of the text typefaces that I've designed. There's some display typefaces that I don't have shown here because you couldn't really license them for use on the web. I mean, they're licensable from the companies that sell them, but they don't license them in web font formats yet. All of these projects sort of developed for different purposes, and some of them developed really for print first and can also be used now on the web. But there are some there, like on the screen, Dasa and Birani, that I sort of drew with a thought that they would be used online. Now, this is a font. It wouldn't be used for a whole lot of text on the website. I mean, I don't think you would read 2,000 words in this font on a website, but it was something that I developed as part of a brief that I got from Google to design a non-connecting handwriting typeface, both in the Latin script, so our Roman letters, and Gurmukhi, which is what you can see the bottom half of that character set. Gurmukhi is a North Indian script, which the main language that it's used to write is Punjabi. So especially in Great Britain, if you travel around outside London, there are a lot of Punjabi speakers. I'm not sure how big the Punjabi-speaking community is in Paris, but I remember the neighborhoods in London when I lived in the UK. And of course, there's a whole parts of northern India where that's the main language. Of course,
it's the main language and main screen printing all around the shops and everything. And so, did you have to learn Punjabi to start writing that?
Well, I had to learn how to handwrite Punjabi. So I can't speak Punjabi or read it. I mean, I know how the letters would sound if you were to try to sound them out, which I won't try to pronounce them though in public.
No, don't worry.
But I have had some Hindi classes before I did this font. I did some other fonts for Devanagari, which is used for writing Hindi and Sanskrit and Marathi. Has even more readers in India than Punjabi. Learning how to work on that kind of writing system was part of my master's degree course in the UK. Which didn't include a linguistic component. I mean, I didn't have language classes at the time, but then after I went back to Germany, I did take a bit of Hindi classes at a university in Berlin. But it's it's always difficult with a foreign language. You take classes, but you don't really speak very much, and with the whole as a class we went once to a restaurant and we ordered the food, but
that's a good start. I think food is a good start for many international things.
I think so too. I mean, I certainly have tried to eat as much of food as possible of writing systems that I've been designing for those linguistic groups, but
because when we were talking earlier, you mentioned that when you arrived in Germany, one of your very first work at that time was in Chinese.
Yeah, that's right. I was working as a student in Germany. I was working for an architectural agency, and I'm not sure if it's exactly the same situation in France, but in Germany there are too many architects. Or I guess you could say there's too many architects for the number of building projects in Germany today. And so the architecture firms that are large and successful have most of their work abroad and quite a lot of building, at least at that time, it was in 2004, was in China. So, it was an architecture studio. I think it had about 250 employees in Germany, maybe some more elsewhere too. And we would bid on projects that were going to be built in China. They built projects in China. There were Chinese employees in the offices in Germany. And so I was working as a designer in kind of the public relations department, and we would make brochures about the buildings that we had already finished. And these were usually in German or in English. But for some of the projects, we wanted to make sure that we had all of the texts in Chinese too, and
to fit more in the environment. To be
well, sure. I mean, it's if you're pitching your company and your work to an audience in another country, you want to make sure that your promotional materials are in that language. So if you want to build buildings in China, you need to explain, I think, the quality of your work and finished projects in language that most people read, even if many of the people who are going to be involved in the decision-making process of what company gets which project speak at least some English or maybe other languages too. And we were talking about that over lunch, because at the time I was working in this office, and instead of InDesign we had Quark Express, and Quark Express didn't support OpenType fonts yet, so it wasn't possible for us to take the text that the Chinese colleagues had written and flow it into the document. So instead we made screenshots of the text from Word, or PDFs from Word, and then brought those PDFs into Quark Express.
Yeah, that must have been, that when you say 2002?
2004.
2004. So 2004, 15 years ago, edition was still like beginning for the everything around Unicode.
Sure, I mean, Quark InDesign was already. I kind of thought at the time that InDesign was already and I'm not just saying this because this is an Adobe thing.
I taught you.
I started using InDesign in 2001 at another company in the US, and had used it in those few years in between 2001 and 2004 much more often than Quark Express. And I liked it more in Quark Express. I liked its typographic handling more. There weren't very many OpenType fonts that were available yet, but Quark Express at the time didn't support OpenType, and InDesign did, and that was just sort of one more reason to move
to
move in that direction. But the great bulk of professional print design at that time, at least in Germany, was still being done in Quark Express.
Yeah, so everywhere, I guess, in Europe, Express was very, very strong. In the US, they had a lot of mix between PageMaker also.
PageMaker, was my first program that I learned PageMaker even when I was a student in high school. I was about 14 or 15. I used it very badly, but I liked it very much, and then I had to switch to Quark, and I was sort of dragged kicking and screaming to Quark Express. So one of the reasons why I was so happy to use InDesign was because I had never really been sort of at home with Quark
any
Express.
Other, I can understand that. Yeah, it's been a long way from that time. If I go on your I'm gonna go back on your website. Is there one of the usually one of my questions with the artists I'm working with, even in production or what, is that which is there one of the font that one of the projects that have been like decisive, like a big transition inside a process, inside your way of thinking, way of working? And is it shown here, or is it something that was used for another client or dedicated font that that you don't have access here?
Well, let me make sure that it's on the site. But really, where you see how a typeface works, and where you learn how your work is really performing, is in use. So most of the typefaces that I've worked on over time are things that I've put out into the world, so to speak, and then they have changed a bit as designers came into contact with them. So this typeface is Malabar. This is sort of commercially the most successful typeface that I have produced. It grew out of my master's thesis in Reading, and was then published by Linotype, which was the company that I was working for at the time. And I don't have it on my website.
Is there like something like fonts in use where it's
oh gosh, you will find a few in use cases of Malabar and fonts in use. If you go to fontsinuse.com, there's a special version of Malabar. What I was sort of trying to get out, I believe he probably has the this might be the out of the box version actually. There's a special version of Malabar that I created for some book designer friends of mine, and I keep meaning to put it up on my website, but it isn't there. I believe there are some photos of it on Flickr. If you go to Flickr to my site and type in Gutenberg, I'm sure it will just come up, because it was used in a scholarly journal in Germany called the Gutenberg Yearbook, which is Gutenberg research, and it's published every year. The 2010 and 2011 editions used the typeface, and the thing was that Malabar, as you see it on my website, has very strong contrast. The vertical strokes are very, very heavy, and it creates a feeling on the page that's very dark and sturdy. And I thought that this would be legible for a number of different printed environments, and it's been used on all sorts of different kinds of paper. But this publications designer wanted a lighter version of the typeface, and something that had less contrast. So what I did was, if you look at the parts of a letter, like the lowercase letter E, you have these thin bits sort of at the top and at the bottom and in the middle. And I left all of the thin strokes with the thickness that they had, and I made the thick strokes thinner. So the whole typeface, its impression on the page became lighter, and there was also much less contrast. And I've since given this font to other book designer friends of mine, and they have used it in projects of theirs too. But there's little of it that I've put up on the internet, because I'm sort of terrible at this thing.
Yeah, but things can happen slowly. It's
right.
You don't have to. I mean, a font, a typeface doesn't. It's not like a small drawing.
Sure.
It's so many drawings at the same place. It's also implementation of hints and everything.
Right.
So it might take way more time. So if people want to try and see how your text is, how their text is doing with your fonts, they can find that directly online.
Right. I have all of the fonts on my website are live, so you can edit. You can edit the text at least on the bottom of the page for each font, and do things like change size, color, number of columns, etc. You can also switch between different fonts in the family.
But you can really grab the feeling of how your page is gonna get.
Sure.
That's good.
I hope so. Anyway,
I think so.
When I had this, when I worked with the designer who designed this version of my website a few years ago, I made him do everything in black and white, because I have the feeling that type is
shape.
Well, it's shape, but color is something that the user really applies to the typeface. So you design a typeface, you're just designing the shape and the spaces in between shapes. And, sometimes if I design a brochure or an invitation or a poster, then I'll add color to the text or to the background. But if you want to look at the way that the typeface is functioning, as I was trying to do or to show to people on my website, I wanted to make everything sort of as visually reduced as possible. So it's very Spartan, I think, the presentation of the fonts there.
Yeah, but I think it works pretty well to give the idea and of how it's working. But when we were talking earlier, you also mentioned that anytime you were building a font, there was this intermediate state where you would export one version of a font, start playing with it, typesetting, starting to make a composition, and you'd print that out to comment, to annotate everything inside.
Right. You can, if you pull this up, if you pull my screen up, I have some test PDFs. So here I have I can show the pages a bit. A 14-page test PDF for a typeface that I did 2 years ago called Rustic, and this was at the stage when it was about 60% finished. So I had more or less a full character set for English and a few other languages and punctuation, so I could set different kinds of text with it. I had different weights. So I have some sort of sample novel text so that I could read several pages of the text and see what jumped out at me in terms of maybe areas where certain letter combinations were too dark, or maybe a letter form itself was too dark or too light. And then I had a page here where I had changed some lowercase letters. So, for instance, each of these columns has a different O in it, and it's not something that you necessarily would see here on screen, but when I printed it out, each of these columns had a slightly different gray value to it. So if you print it out and you hold it up in front of your face, maybe half a meter away, and you squint, you see this sort of gray color to the text, and I was trying to get that to be even, so that nothing would really jump out as being too light or too heavy, and so I sort of went along with that. Other test sheets that I've pulled up. This is from the Gurmukhi project. It looks it looks a lot like the website. I have here one column of Latin text, one column of text in the Gurmukhi as I was developing it. This was also when I was maybe about halfway through the project, and then I had a system font Gurmukhi there for comparison to sort of see what maybe expected text would look like. And here even if you look at the Latin text, that's not real text yet because I didn't have a full character set. It's just sort of a dummy text to give me a chance to see how the letter shapes were working with one another, what was too dark, what was too light, etc.
That's good. That's very good, because it really gives a glimpse of the process for people, because I don't know, I'm gonna ask our relatively small audience today, because today is in English, so it's always complicated to get French people following us on that subject. How many of you use we use fonts, typefaces during your daily production? Donc je vais, au cas où il resterait encore des francophones, combien d'entre vous utilisent ou produisent de la typographie? Est-ce que vous l'utilisez en production graphique? Est-ce que vous l'utilisez habillé, appliqué, etc., etc. Je suis assez curieux de savoir qui fait quoi dans l'audience. So I'm very curious about our audience, like what they do, how they use it. And I'm gonna see if some people are still there in the chat, because it's always like quite. On typography, it's always strange, and people are waiting for French things. So I'm trying to grab them back. Come back, people. So during that, when we look at your website, we can see that you've got a couple of fonts, but one of the usual questions about that, people imagine it takes a long time to process a font. In the case of Malabar, do you know how long it took you to set a first rendering?
Well,
and then...
I mean, Malabar was a typeface that I started while I was a graduate student, and so it was kind of a structured development, at least for the first half or so. So it probably took slightly longer than it would take if I were doing that now. My website is also Rustic, which is this PDF that I have open as well. This was a typeface that was developed in a sort of a concise period of time. I think I worked on it for about 2.5 months, all at once. Other typefaces that I've worked on have been things where I might have worked on it for half a year or a year, but not every day. So, for instance, Carter Sands was a project that I worked on off and on in combination with other projects, probably for about half a year. Demos Next is a project that I worked on with 2 other designers, and I sort of, my part on it took maybe a year, and the other 2 designers, their part on the typeface took another 2 or 3 years before it was released. And this was not because we were all, it took that much total man hours, or woman hours too in this case, but because all of us were juggling it together with other projects.
Yeah, it's always it can get complicated also to get focus during all the process of designing a font. How is it to work with many people on the same set of characters? Is it like one of you did the regular and the other ones did something else, or how is it?
Yeah, I think that's the easiest way to do it. As you just mentioned, really, one person will do the regular, and the other person can then make a heavier weight of regular, and you know, ideally both people will then look at each other's work. So if I do the regular and you do the heavy weight, you know, then I'll take a look at the heavy and see if there's anything that I would change, and you would take a look at the regular and see if there's anything that you would change. We might interpolate the weights in between the regular and the heavy, so the semi-bold and bold. It's I guess it would also be imaginable that a third person could do the italic, although that's starting to get to be a lot of people. So maybe we would each do, again, sort of half of the italic. But there, I suspect we would also divide up who was doing which weights or which masters, because if you had 2 people working inside the same weight, and like, well, I'm going to do all of the straight letters like the N and the M and the H, and you'll do the round letters like the O and the E and the
that
C.
Would be start to look.
They won't match, and we'll just pull our hair out trying to correct each other's work, and that probably isn't the best way to do it. What happened though with Demos, I mean, it's a revision of a typeface from Harold Unger that he designed in the 70s, a revision and an expansion. And so he started redesigning his typeface from scratch, but he wouldn't do complete alphabets. So he would, for instance, you know, I think he would have drawn the N or the M, but not the other one, and not the U, and maybe not the H either.
So
like
you get to make your own rotation, duplication.
You sort of see like, okay, the form is already here. I know what he's doing, and I'll carry that out. It's a lot of production work. Is not necessarily the most creative part of type design, but that is something that you could, with the right guidance, that you could give to someone else.
Yeah, completely. Now that's very interesting, because it's always like on the graphic design part, I've always got the question with like small posters, and you want to play with different typefaces. So nowadays it's become really easier with the Adobe Fonts, because you get basically everything you can, everything they licensed. And the thing is, now you can say like, okay, I want 3 characters in that font, 3 in another font. For a poster, it's very practical. But when you start to dig a little bit more as a graphic designer into typeface, you start to think like, oh, maybe I can start doing that part. I can start doing a couple of letters more for that title, maybe. And it's going to be like 5, 10, 15 letters. And you realize you're not making a full typeface. I saw that when you were switching applications, you're using glyphs. Has it been like that for last couple of years?
Yeah, I would say probably since about end of 2013. Although again, not continuously. Like a lot of times I'll work on multiple projects simultaneously, and one project will be in glyphs and another project will be in FontLab, which is an older application. And I've also done some projects together with other designers in RoboFont, which is another Mac font editor that uses a lot of Python scripting. And what I end up working in has to do a lot with the definition of a project. So am I working by myself or am I working together with other people? What software are the other people using? And most importantly, I think is, is this all being done from scratch, or is there old project data from 5 years ago or from 10 years ago that we're reusing? Because then it might make sense to just work in the old
in the old software to be sure to get all the information, all the automations if there were. But for Demos, which was 1975, I guess there was no software.
Well, no, there had been intermediary steps in between. So Demos was an early digital font, and Herod drew the pixels.
Okay.
So it was originally stored. So fonts, to take a step back, fonts today are stored as outlines. So it's you draw vector shapes in PostScript fonts. So most of the fonts that end in the format .otf instead of .ttf, although TrueType fonts are also outline based. In the OpenType format fonts or CFF fonts, the outline is saved in PostScript usually, which is the same kind of language that is behind Photoshop and Illustrator. So drawing a letter in Illustrator and drawing a letter in a font application use the same kind of tools. They use the same process, and it saves in the same language, sort of under the hood. And there were previous digital font formats before Adobe wrote PostScript, and one of them was the ability to store size-specific bitmaps. So that's how Demos was born. Eventually, it had outlines sort of wrapped around it, and there were several generations of those. And I think part of what this sort of conversion through several generations, it got to the point, perhaps, for Herod, that he thought that the original design had sort of disappeared a bit, and he could draw it again and it would be better.
Yeah, it's kind of strange that one moment you decide to put your work back on the alors in French we would say sur l'établi, back on the workbench, and to start like digging again more. Did he like had some characters? Maybe Euro, the Euro sign?
Well, I mean, these had also been in other versions of Demos, because Demos wasn't a project that had it wasn't a typeface that had died. It was always available for sale, and there were various versions on the market even when he started working on Demos, on the new Demos. I think he wanted to do sort of like a ground up refresh. He wanted the typeface to be read on iPhones, for instance. He was saying, like, look, I use this was like about 2010 when the project started. The iPhone and especially the iPad were still quite new, and he was saying, look, I read on this thing all the time. Why can't Demos be redrawn so that it would work in this kind of environment? I mean, the old fonts technically would have worked in this environment too. It wasn't that it didn't work, but it just wasn't it wasn't the way. It didn't have the kind of sharpness and freshness and internal consistency that he wanted it to have. And sort of by discarding the previous digital data and drawing again, you know, the older fonts had baggage in it that weren't necessarily the result. They weren't necessary, and they weren't even necessarily the result of decisions that he had made. And other people had worked on the font files, and somehow things had gotten in there that wasn't really
his choice and his way of thinking.
And maybe he didn't even realize that at the time, you know. But you know, over the years, you had a bit earlier. You had the German government design up. They don't use demos anymore, but for about almost 20 years, the federal German government, all of the different ministries were using demos and praxis to typefaces from Harold Unger, who's Dutch and not German, for everything almost. And you know, these are quite prominent uses. I'm sure he saw printed examples of these typefaces being used all the time, and you sort of see things in the project, and you wonder, well, how did that get there? Is this really how it should be? Maybe it's best to do this over again. You know, you see with typefaces that are not new. This happens all the time. So you know, Linotype just brought out another Helvetica. It's like the fourth, at least, version of Helvetica that the sort of like the combined Linotype Monotype company has produced. Not to mention all of the other Helveticas that have been created in the last, even just digital Helveticas in the last 30 years. And they thought, you know, okay, we can do this over. It's probably going to be a better product. I'm sure that was the motivation behind it. And really, this is something that happens with every older typeface that gets a lot of use and has gone through several format conversions. You know, eventually people think the way to make this typeface work the way we think it should is to discard all of the old data.
Yeah,
and start again.
You start fresh. You get just clean vector, and you don't have to think about how they were doing the hinting 20, 35 years ago.
Well, even you know, like, you can draw finer curves now. Both because people have more experience drawing Bezier curves now than they did in the 1980s, because screen rasterization is better, printer rasterization is better. You know, it's sort of that there's drawing everything again now. You have the opportunity to give things finesse that would have been much harder to do
at that time,
even though the underlying technology is in many ways the same today.
Yeah, we're still working with quadratic Bezier. It's still the same, like one anchor point, two handles, and very same thing since Illustrator at the beginning. Yeah, that's very funny to see that there's this continuity, and there's also a lot of smaller things, because you mentioned when you were talking about Dasa and everything about Gurmukhi, that you have to think about the different language version, about the OpenType features. When were you first? When did you first encounter the OpenType features? What has been your experience with that?
Well, I've been using OpenType fonts for about as long as OpenType fonts have been supported in Adobe applications. I think that the first OpenType, I mean, the OpenType format is from the 90s, but I think the first Adobe fonts are from either the end of 2000 or 2001. And in okay, I wasn't using them in 2001 exactly, but in either the end of 2002 or the beginning of 2003, I went to an InDesign user group meeting that was all about how to use the OpenType features in InDesign. And you know, I was working for a company at that time in Washington, D.C., and we wanted to use one OpenType feature. We were using InDesign. We did not have OpenType fonts, except the ones that came with, I mean, I'm sure some were bundled with InDesign at the time already, but we weren't using them in our corporate setup. So the fonts we were actually working with weren't OpenType fonts. And we had, you know, we were making these books and these reports all the time, probably hundreds a year. And on the back cover, we had a serial number. And the serial number was alphanumeric. So it had letters and numbers. And that meant that there would be zeros and capital O's in the number. And this was, there was a problem with the differentiation. You know, you have to look very closely to be able to tell one or the other. So we thought, well, you know, you can put like a dot or a slash in the zero, and then you know that it's a zero. And there's an OpenType feature just for that. It's called /0, and you know, there's a, if you look in the, you know, in the OpenType menus in applications, you'll see that as one of the options. At least if the font has it, and you can just have that 0 come up in your text, and that's you know, this is probably not the main usage case for InDesign in the world. It's certainly not why InDesign
has been made for.
Had supported the format, but you know, that was the sort of hook. And what I started using then the most before I started designing fonts for writing systems like Devanagari and Gurmukhi, which rely entirely on OpenType features and Unicode encoding to do the necessary shaping for the proper linguistic representation of the languages. I mean, that's what OpenType was really made for. Where I was using OpenType features the most before then was to switch between figure styles and to activate small caps, because I like to have that level of typographic sophistication both in the fonts I make and especially when I'm using fonts. I will almost never use a font if it doesn't have these features because I invariably will be creating a hierarchy for a document that's a few pages long. It has a lot of text in it. You know, I'm going to get to the point where I'm going to be like, oh, it would be really nice just to use small caps here. And then the font doesn't have small caps, and I get frustrated. And so I weed out almost all fonts that don't have small caps or old style figures as an available option. Things like that from my, sort of from my deck or from my selection. Of course, it happens that I use fonts that don't have these things in them, but I really want them in fonts that I select.
Of course. Some of the when I typed your name inside Adobe Fonts, the one font that was out was the Demos. And none of the others yet.
That's right. That has to do with licensing politics.
Of course, it's
various
completely
companies and Adobe.
So if you guys wanna try that someday, you still get access to Demos next, because it's been conceived by Gerhard, as you mentioned, and but they don't mention everyone behind the family.
Well, I must come up somehow because I'm tagged in it. I'm sure that, you know, somewhere in the description under the list of designers,
there might be your name somewhere.
And Linda Hintz's name comes up. I think we're both mentioned in the font files itself. It's reading the metadata out of the font files. There's probably a description text at least on the English version of the website where these things are mentioned. But that's fine. I mean, I don't need to be mentioned in connection with this typeface. I mean,
but I think it's always like part of your curriculum to find okay, there's this font. This is my font. This is part of it, and since we were talking about all the features, that's where I usually go and grab them.
The features are the features all here. I hope they are.
I think so. And the very first thing is that you get all the families, and it's quite a huge one.
Yeah, it's a large family. It has sort of real italics. The italics are all redrawn they're not just slanted versions of the Romans. They have some different letter forms in them. But I know that it has old style figures, and I hope it has.
I don't know.
I hope it has.
Oh yeah, they do.
Caps in it. I know. I
so,
do small caps.
so they put like everything. Every language is available for the desktop and for the web. So you get so many languages.
Sure. I mean, you have all the European languages,
and they've got most of the open types, but they don't. They don't give information on what you find as open type here. But that's fun. That's fun to see how it can be working and how you can be working with that one, and if you can get more information. And for the ones who just jump in there, you can try that at home on your own machine, and you just go over to the Typekit, formerly Typekit. Someday I'm gonna grab that one. It took me years to say animate instead of Flash too. And you can even get that directly from a InDesign page when you're working with that, and you want to type your typeface, you want to put some filling text, and from there you just grab the font, you go there, and you can ask to find any font inside, and you can try it directly there. So it means also, like, if I want to have demos, right now he can find it online, and he's gonna give it to me back here, and I can use it anytime I need. And that's where I'm gonna find it. That's good. So back on your screen, maybe how you work. What kind of process could you show? What kind of things could you share to the audience about how you're making a font, and is it something that you often share, by the way?
Oh, sure. I teach type design occasionally at various German schools in their design programs. So I try to come up with ways to get young designers to learn how to draw letters. I think that the most important thing about type design, and this sounds maybe at first glance a bit counterintuitive, but most of what we do in our work is not actually drawing the letter forms themselves. So for instance, here I have in Dasa I have an outline of the lowercase n, and you can see it, as you said before, there are points and the handles coming out to define the curves, and that's it. You could draw this letter N in Illustrator instead of Glyphs or another font editor. But what working in a font editor allows you to do immediately is define the amount of space that comes before and after each character. And so it's really sort of in fine-tuning the amount of space that come between letters that takes up the bulk of our time. And that's not necessarily what you might expect. A lot of graphic designers do really like to design letters, and it's one thing to draw a giant G on a poster. It's another thing to take that letter and then turn it into an alphabet where all of the letters can be infinitely recombined into different combinations. So one of the most important characters then that you have in your typeface is space. And this also sounds somewhat counterintuitive, I imagine, but when you make a new font, you have to define how wide the space between the words is going to be. If you go and you look at even one page of text, and you want to find all of the word spaces, this word space comes up all the time.
Yeah.
So, you know, usually in English and in German and probably in French too, the lowercase e is the letter that comes up in your text the most often. But in terms of total characters in a font, space and punctuation are really very important, because they come up just as much, and they frame the way that, you know, a paragraph of text is going to feel on the page. So what I would do normally when I would design a font is, you know, I would draw a few of the letters, and I would define some amount of space on either side, and then I leave the font editor entirely. So, you know, it's a relatively easy process in a font editor to export a font. You can export a font even if it just has one letter. You know, technically, a font is going to work if it has a name and at least one character. And so, you know, I export that into I put everything directly into my fonts folder on the system, in a folder I call test, so that I can just delete everything. But a great feature about you know, the Creative Cloud is that you can have a special folder that you just call document fonts. It probably has a localized name in French, and if you have your file,
they haven't.
Oh,
they haven't.
Document fonts.
Yeah. That makes it easier for everyone. And
very good.
I don't know if around here we've got people knowing about this feature, but when you open any InDesign document you receive, if it has the document fonts folder inside, then you can open it and you're going to see your typeface.
Right.
And if the typeface is on Adobe Fonts, you won't have access to the files inside, but you just need to get a connection to the Creative Cloud. That makes things easy.
Good. It also makes font management much easier, because you don't need to have central management of your own font files necessarily. If you have files that aren't in the cloud, you can just put them in this folder, and you have your, you know, the folder that the documents folder is inside has to have your InDesign file, but then you can just open the document up. So then what I do is I make a sample text file in InDesign, and I print that out, and I mark that up. And I might decide that the space is too narrow, and then I could go back to the font, and I could make the space wider. Here, just for the for the example, I'm going to make it very wide, and then I can export that again.
But in that case, it's gonna like exchange and replace the one before.
That's what I want. Yes. Just to make sure, I'm going to delete my my old file. Okay. And let me change the name of this, because of course I've done something terrible and I can't find a file. So here I'm going to export this, and I want to have this, I'm going to put this in my test folder, and then I have the now it's not going to work.
Yeah, it's how it's working when you're like live demo, live showcases. There has to be something breaking.
Well, these spaces should get bigger and are not. So sorry, that didn't work. But then you would see automatically here, ideally in the paragraph of text, that the space everywhere would, between all the words, would get bigger. You would have a reflow of each line of the text, and then you could look at that on your screen and in a printout and see if that is an improvement on what you had done before or not.
Yeah, of course, because that space thing is really the most important part of it. For that grace, how you say that? Finesse management.
So another thing that you that you can decide what you're going to do is how much differentiation in weight would be helpful for people who are using your font. So here, this family has a bold, and there's also several other weights in it. There's an extra bold and a heavy that are heavier than the bold, and a semi-bold, which is lighter. And the way that type design is usually set up today is that you interpolate intermediate weights and also whips between different styles. So here in Rustic, I have two different masters. I have a lighter master and a heavier master, and I've set up inside the file that I have those same number of instances that I showed before. But it's possible that I could decide that this, this bold needs to be heavier than it is. So, I could change the weight of this, and I would get a slight preview here on my screen of how it's changing. But really, what I would want to do here is export the family and run that through in another test, because on screen in InDesign I would be able to see how those weights are comparing with each other.
When you're working with all the diacritics and everything around in your font, it's always I suppose it's not coming at the first process. You have to think the regular ASCII reduce set, then you go to diacritics, or and they are just an extension, or do you have to make a real thinking about it when you start drawing it?
I think you do have to think about diacritics at an early stage of drawing. So now in Western European languages, there's a whole range of diacritics that are typical now, and it's probably not necessary to design all of those before you have your basic alphabet in uppercase and lowercase done. Yeah. But I think you need to have some of them already, because these things relate to the general language of your font, and they make the total color of your text darker. So are they going to make your whole text, like Czech and Hungarian each have about 11 different diacritics. So that's more ink that comes onto the page, or more pixels that are activated on screen. And if the diacritics are large and dark, it's going to make the entire typeface have a heavier feeling. So maybe you want to dial the regular weight of the typeface lighter or something. But even on a more basic level than color, you have shape relationships. So like the dot on the lowercase I, how does that relate with the diaresis on top of letters, and how does it relate with the a coup and grave and things like that? It's not just a matter of shape differentiation. I obviously I want the I, who, and the I, just as normal dot, to be recognizable as two different letters. But you know, that's just the basic. You know, you have to do that. Like, you know, are you drawing forms that can live in the same universe as each other? And if you come up with a solution for the diacritics at this stage, those shapes may go on to influence terminals of other letters in the alphabet. So they really are a bit more fundamental, I guess, than the role that they often play in the design process, which is like a step 2 or a step 3. So, you know, like right now, this grav and this dot have quite different forms in this typeface than the terminals of the letters. So, you know, what is going on here, I mean, is quite different than these. But here, they're much more unified. So the dot on the I has exactly the same shape as the kind of terminals that come in the place of serifs on the I or on top of the L or the B or the D, etc. So that's an I dot. It's not a diacritic exactly, but it's a character that will get referenced in a lot of diacritics, and these need to be sort of a piece with the general harmony of the alphabet. What I think also helps, if you start at this earlier stage with your diacritics, sort of before everything is totally set in stone, is you can decide if you're going to have different forms for the capital letters and
because you get the angle
and lower place, right? Because you typically, you know, there's only so much space that's available for diacritics on top of letters. So you can sort of admit that is an issue and give them a different angle, their own design that sort of differentiates them from the lowercase, or you can try to make the diacritics that you have from the lowercase work somehow in that space. Maybe you make the capital letters even smaller to do that. But this kind of decision of, you know, okay, lowercase, uppercase, small caps, are you going to the same kind of diacritics? Are they going to be 2 different forms or 3 different forms? This probably shouldn't come after you've decided you're not going to change your letter forms anymore at all.
Yeah, I can understand that. And that's the at that kind of moment, you're gonna be printing a lot, doing a lot of tests to see how it's working with all the diacritics. Do you have like a favorite text sample for Hungarian where you would find many diacritics all around, or do you?
What I do to find text samples is I really use Wikipedia a lot. So if you go to you know, for Hungary, I think Hungary is with the HU abbreviation, you go to the starting page, and I can't read Hungarian, but there's every day there's articles that are suggested as, you know, the main topics, and you can, or the featured topics, and you can pick something based on the photos, or if you recognize some of the words or some of the links. That's probably not a super controversial topic, because, you know, sometimes you're just making your test sheets at home. It really doesn't matter what text you're using, but you go somewhere and you bring your test and you show your test sheet to someone, and you may have taken a text in another language where you have no idea what it actually means, but it could be a you know, it could be a very controversial subject, and you know, it's also fine to use controversial text, I guess, in your, but you want to be aware of what you're doing.
Yeah.
So, for instance, when I was when I was working with typefaces for Northern Indian scripts, at the time they didn't have as many long articles on Wikipedia as they do now. They were more stubs. So what I did is I would go to newspaper websites and I would take the cricket articles. Because every day
new text.
There's new text about cricket.
Something very different,
right.
With names, with different...
it's probably not controversial. I mean, a little bit of politics is always in sports, but you know, like you're not dealing with issues of
you're not having
something
very complicated. Right.
There's always a lot of numbers to bot that there, and also what you get with sports scores is you have interesting kinds of number punctuation combinations because, like I think you said before, there's the scores and but there's all of these other stats that they come up when you report on matches.
Where you're gonna try to find a different way of combining. Do you because numbers are quite important inside a letter typeset. And do you plan everything, or do you leave a lot to the software to do that for you, like finding fractions, finding ordinates, exponents?
Well, the regular numbers that come up most often in a font like the old style figures and the lining figures, those I would always draw by hand without any kind of assistance, I guess. But what I have often done for the numbers that you put together into fractions, the superiors and the inferiors, the numerators, denominators, is that I would take these and if you have a font that's a multiple master font, so it has multiple, you know, it has a light master and a heavier master in it, and you have these shapes in their full size versions. You can run scripts,
like
Python scripts that will shrink them down, but will shrink them down in a way that the stem thicknesses aren't proportionally structured. Because if you would just shrink it down, like these are 60% of the full height, and if you just shrink something 60%, it suddenly is 60% lighter too. So you want to shrink down, but you do have to reduce the stroke thickness too, but maybe you only want to reduce the stroke thickness. You have to test this out with each typeface a bit, but maybe you want to reduce the stroke thickness so that it's 80% of the thickness instead of 100 or 60%, and that is something that I do with scripts. And so you do that for all of the numbers, and then you move the numbers around. So I would, sort of have master forms in one position, and then these other ones are sort of just references that I say, okay, move those up by 200 units or so, and then from those you can generate the fractions. So you can pre-compose your own fractions in the font, but you also will usually, if you have all those characters already, you can just write a fractions feature that will allow you to create fractions, for instance, in InDesign. And glyphs will write a lot of features for you automatically if you've named your features correctly. So this here is an auto-generated OpenType fractures feature. It's a pretty simple feature, and in this case it's just taken all of these pre-composed forms that I made and made it so that if you type 1/8 that you'll get the 1/8 form, etc. But I could tool this more so that
to give it,
it would create any kind of fraction on the fly, since I have all of the necessary characters in the font.
For the any ligatures can be used that way to.
You can use ligatures that way too, but for ligatures you will almost always want to draw your ligating forms. I mean, here I have
directly as a character,
right, because you know, the way that F and B would otherwise come together,
F space B,
the application is not going to know what exactly it should remove here.
Of course, yeah.
So I would draw that, and then if I've named it properly here, the way that it's named F_B, the application can write the OpenType feature so that will get
very interesting.
substituted in.
A couple of months ago on the YouTube French channel, so that was in French for the people who are still in just a French speaker and were wondering. I hosted a session with Franz Hoffman. He's working for on a small software named FontSelf. I don't know if you've heard of that. And it's to me it has been a very interesting way of thinking about typography, because I'm gonna switch my screen quickly. It's definitely made for the graphic designer inside of me that was too lazy to build a complete font, but that was interested for like posters or whatever. So I was starting to think that way, like maybe there's different dates, different characters I would have drawn. So I made those characters, and then I realized that I could just organize them in place and do part of the job you're doing, which is make a letter, put every number inside, just drag those as an uppercase alphabet. That's gonna be like processing quite easily, and then you can start playing with that, and that has been pretty funny to play with.
That's great. And what I like to do with tools like these is you can do the first step this way.
The very first step.
You know, and of course you can, here on your screen you can see there are all of the metrics, so the character width and the left side bearing and right side bearing. You can edit that all in this plugin, which is really a good chunk of the work that needs to be done. But once you make the font from this, you can also open this in a font editor, and you can edit.
And then you can tweak, and you can. That's.
So you know, like here to get like the basic letters and the spacing. I would definitely use a tool like this, and I would absolutely encourage other people to use tools like this. If someone brought, you know, a font to me and said, okay, I've gotten it up to this level and I don't know what to do next, I don't think it's working the way I want, then I would open it up in the font editor and try to create maybe more consistency between the thicknesses of the horizontal strokes. So, you know, in the font editor, you can you work with layers. The layers are a bit more primitive than in you know, in Illustrator you could have like 5,000 layers, but you know, you have a background layer in every font editor. It's called something different in every font editor, but in Glyphs it's called the background, and you get to it by pressing Command B for background, and you can paste vector shapes in the background. So you know, if I paste an I behind both stems of the H, you know, here this is also a kind of boring example because of course the thicknesses there are the same already, but this allows me to check for consistency. And you know, I would go through all the letters and I would see, well, how does the curve of the capital O differ from the D? Is it the same? Is it the same width? Here the O is a little bit lighter than the D. Do I want to make any changes to the D?
So you can you can definitely switch and try.
It gives me a lot. It gives me more analysis capabilities. But when it comes down to like actually making the letter form wider or narrower, or the strokes thicker or thinner, this isn't work in and of itself that intrinsically has to be done inside of font editor. That can be done in any vector drawing application. You could even do that in a text editor. If you exported this in an XML format, it's just numbers.
It's just numbers, but you'd have to find your way inside inside the different numbers. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Thank you. Thank you very much. I guess we're done quite a bit of work and discovery. I don't know if the audience has some other questions, because they've been very quiet. I know English plus typography is always very minimum audience, and I suppose also that most of the people who want to meet you have already registered for tonight's session at Type Paris, and it always happens because I know Jean-François Porchez always makes like full rooms for our audience. So I'm not worried at all about
come to the event tonight and I'll see you there.
Yeah, for the ones interested in the event, it's going to take place in Le Tank, just near Bastille in Paris. And you can register, but I guess as every year,
might be sold out.
Yeah, they might be sold out. It's always the main problem when we work on those events. If I go to Type Paris 1918 and the event, Nick Misani and you, register. Is it okay, or is there still some space? I don't know.
It might work out.
Yeah. 130 people, so I don't know. You have to count and to see if you can get registered. I guess it's a bit too late for today, but you still have a way to get registered.
A whole month for events.
Yeah. Every Thursday, donc tous les jeudis. Pour les francophones, les talks auront lieu en anglais aussi le soir. Hein. On ne va pas apprendre à nos speakers à parler français dans la semaine. Ça risquerait d'être un petit peu compliqué. Donc voilà, ici 158, so 160 people going, which means it's crowded, and a couple of them are just gonna stay in line outside, wait for their place, and if they don't get one, maybe they're just gonna have a lunch around, dinner around. That's the things happening. Merci beaucoup, thank you very much, Dan Reynolds, for being with us, and see you tonight on the event, and good luck with the rest of the
All right, thank you.
Merci beaucoup, et à très bientôt. Au revoir.